Jacob Archer watched the smoke curl up from the barrel of his own pistol and did not recognize the man staring back at him from the saloon mirror. It was the spring of 1878, in a cattle town called Larkin's Crossing, Kansas, where the wind carried the smell of prairie grass and gunpowder in equal measure. The man on the floor behind him, a drover named Purdy Slate who had drawn first over a card game gone wrong, was already still, and the room had gone quiet except for the ragged breathing of a dozen witnesses who would swear later that Jacob Archer had given the man every chance to walk away. But Jacob was not listening to them. He was looking at the mirror behind the long mahogany bar, its silver backing spotted with age, and in it he saw a stranger. The stranger had his jaw, his gray eyes, the crescent scar above his left eyebrow that a Comanche arrow had left him with 9 years before. But the eyes in the mirror were flat and cold, the eyes of a man who had done this so many times that his hands no longer shook, and Jacob Archer, 34 years old, a man who had sworn to himself 2 winters past that he was finished with killing, felt something in his chest go hollow and sick. He holstered the Colt slowly, the way a man might set down a snake he had just realized he was holding, and he walked out of the Alhambra Saloon into the white afternoon light without collecting the winnings that had started the whole affair. Behind him he heard the barkeep, a heavy-set man named Otis Fenn, telling the sheriff's deputy that it had been a fair fight, self-defense plain as day, and that Purdy Slate had been drunk and looking for trouble since noon. Jacob did not doubt that this was true. It did not make the hollow feeling go away. He had come to Larkin's Crossing 18 months before with the intention of becoming an ordinary man. He had bought 40 acres of grassland 3 miles north of town with money that he did not like to think too hard about how he had earned, and he had built a small house and a smaller barn, and he had told himself that if he worked the land long enough and hard enough, the other life, the life of the gun, would fade out of him like a fever breaking. He had not touched a deck of cards in a saloon in 4 months before that afternoon. He had told himself he was only stopping in for a beer and a bit of company, because a man alone on a homestead could go strange in the head from silence, and Otis Fenn's saloon was as close to human warmth as Larkin's Crossing offered on a Tuesday afternoon. He should have known better. Trouble did not care how long a man had been behaving himself. Esther Hayes arrived in Larkin's Crossing that same week, though Jacob did not yet know her name, riding on the bench seat of a hired wagon with her late husband's tools rattling in the bed behind her, and a deed to 160 acres folded inside her Bible. She was 26 years old, a widow of 8 months, with dark hair she kept pinned beneath a gray bonnet, and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, brown with flecks of gold when the light caught them right. Her husband, Thomas Hayes, had died of a fever the previous autumn, leaving her with the homestead they had filed on together under the Homestead Act, a soddy house, 2 mules, and a debt to the Larkin's Crossing Mercantile that she intended to pay off with her first wheat crop if the weather cooperated and the grasshoppers did not come. What she had not counted on, when she buried Thomas in the small cemetery behind the Methodist church and resolved to keep the land rather than sell it and go back east to her sister in Ohio, was a man named Silas Croft. Croft owned the Diamond C, the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, and he had recently acquired, through means that were never entirely clear to anyone in town, an understanding with the Kansas Pacific Railroad that a spur line would be built through Larkin's Crossing within the year, provided the right-of-way could be secured. The right-of-way, as it happened, ran directly through the Hayes homestead and 4 others besides. Croft had been buying out the smaller claims one by one, at prices that made the mercantile owner wince when he heard the numbers, and the families who did not want to sell found that their fences were cut, their wells fouled, and their cattle scattered in the night by men nobody could quite identify, though everyone in town had a fair guess. Esther Hayes did not intend to sell. She drove her wagon into Larkin's Crossing on a Thursday morning to buy seed corn and nails for a new henhouse. And it was there, outside the mercantile, that her wagon wheel finally gave up the fight it had been waging since Nebraska. The wheel simply folded outward, the spokes splintering with a crack like a rifle shot, and the wagon lurched hard enough that Esther was thrown from the bench into the dust of the street, her bonnet knocked sideways, her palms scraped raw where she had caught herself. Jacob Archer was walking out of the blacksmith's shop at that exact moment, having gone to have a plowshare repaired, and he saw the whole thing happen not 20 feet in front of him. He did not think. He simply moved, the way he had been trained to move in other circumstances entirely, and he was at her side before the dust had settled, kneeling in the street, his hand under her elbow. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" he asked. She looked up at him, startled, her creek-water eyes wide, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Jacob was aware in a distant way that people were watching, that Otis Fenn had come out of the saloon doorway with a rag still in his hand, that the blacksmith's hammer had gone silent behind him. He was aware mostly of the woman in front of him, the way her breath was coming too fast, the small tremor in her scraped hands. "I believe I am only embarrassed," Esther said, and there was a wry humor in her voice even through the shock of the fall, which was the first thing about her that Jacob liked. "My wagon, on the other hand, has seen better days." He helped her to her feet, and together they looked at the wheel, which was beyond any simple repair. 2 spokes had snapped clean through, and the iron rim had bent nearly double. "That'll need a new wheel and tire," Jacob said. "Baxter can build you one, but it will take him the better part of 2 days, and you'll want your goods carried home in the meantime." "I have no way to carry them home if my wagon cannot move, mister." She stopped, realizing she did not know his name. "Archer. Jacob Archer." "Esther Hayes." She held out her hand, remembered it was scraped and bleeding lightly, and drew it back with an apologetic half-smile. "I have a homestead north of town." "I do not suppose you know the way to the old Hendricks claim." Jacob's jaw tightened, though he tried not to let it show. He did know the Hendricks claim. He knew it because it was one of the properties that Silas Croft's foreman, a lean and unpleasant man named Dutch Meagher, had been talking about in the saloon just 2 days before, saying it was only a matter of time before the widow there saw reason. "I know it," Jacob said. "It sits along Rambler Creek, about 4 miles past my own place. I could carry your goods out for you this afternoon, if you'll allow it. My wagon's sound, and I've nothing pressing today." Esther studied him for a moment. A tall man, sun-weathered, with the kind of quiet stillness about him that some women might have found unsettling, and which she, having buried a husband and crossed half a continent alone in a hired wagon, found instead reassuring. There was a leanness to him, an economy of movement, but his eyes, when they met hers, held nothing sharp in them, only a kind of careful attention. "I would be grateful, Mr. Archer," she said. "Though I warn you, my mules are stubborn and my house is small, and I have very little to offer you for your trouble beyond coffee and my thanks." "Coffee will do fine," Jacob said, and found, to his own mild surprise, that he meant it. He did not tell her, as they loaded her seed corn and nails into the back of his own wagon and set off north out of town, that he had killed a man 3 days before in the saloon whose doorway they had just passed. He did not tell her that the reason he had left the mercantile counter so quickly, when the drover Purdy Slate had come in loud and drunk, and looking for a fight, was that some old instinct in him had recognized the shape of the trouble before it had fully formed. He did not tell her any of the things that sat coiled and heavy in his chest, because there was no good way to say them, and because for the length of that 4-mile ride, with the prairie wind moving the new green grass in long silver waves and a woman beside him asking sensible questions about soil and rainfall, he felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something like peace. The Hendricks claim, when they reached it, showed the marks of neglect that came from a woman managing a homestead alone through a hard winter. The soddy house was sound, but the roof wanted mending, and one corner of the corral fence had been pushed over, The rails scattered as though something heavy had leaned against them deliberately. "That fence was standing when I left this morning," Esther said quietly, and Jacob saw her face go still in a way that told him this was not the first such thing to happen. "Cattle get through fences," he said, though he did not believe it, not with the rails scattered the way they were, not lying where a cow might have knocked them but stacked crooked against each other as if pried apart by hand. "Cattle do not open gates and leave them open, Mr. Archer," Esther said, "and this is the third time in a month. I know whose cattle graze near here, and I know whose foreman has twice suggested to me, very politely, that a widow alone might find life easier in town." Jacob set down the sack of seed corn he was carrying and looked at the fence, and then at the horizon, where the low hills rolled away toward the Diamond Seas range, and something old and unwelcome stirred in him, a familiar tightening across the shoulders that he associated with trouble he had once been paid to cause rather than prevent. "Silas Croft," he said. "You know him." "I know of him. I've done no business with the man." This much, at least, was true, though Jacob was aware that Croft's foreman Dutch Meagher had approached him once, 6 months back, with an offer of easy money for a job Jacob had not asked the particulars of before turning it down flat. He had turned it down because he had wanted badly to be the kind of man who no longer took such offers. He had not asked what the job concerned, because some part of him had not wanted to know how close he had come to saying yes. "He wants my land for his railroad," Esther said, straightening the fence rails herself, refusing Jacob's offer of help with a small shake of her head that told him she needed, just then, to do something with her hands. "He has told me as much himself, quite pleasantly, over tea in his own parlor, which he invited me to under the pretense of offering condolences on my husband's passing. He offered me $800 for a homestead that Thomas and I built with our own hands, and that is worth, with the well and the breaking already done, twice that at least. I told him I was not selling. He smiled and told me that homesteading was hard on a woman alone, and that he hoped nothing further would happen to make it harder." Jacob felt the old cold clarity settle over him, the same clarity that had let him put a bullet through Purdy Slate's shoulder before the drunk fool's own pistol had cleared its holster, and he did not like the way it felt now any better than he had liked it in the saloon mirror. But he set the rails back into place with her, working in silence for a while, and when the fence was mended he said only, "You should not be out here alone at night, Mrs. Hayes." "I have very little choice in the matter," Esther said, and there was no self-pity in it, only a plain accounting of fact. "I filed on this land in my own name after Thomas passed, under the widow's provision. It is mine by law. I intend to keep it." "Then you'll want a neighbor who checks on you," Jacob said, and was faintly surprised at himself again for the offer, "seeing as I'm only 4 miles off. I'll ride by of an evening time to time if that suits you." Esther looked at him for a long moment. A stranger still, a man whose name she had known for less than 3 hours, offering something that in a gentler world would not have needed offering, because a widow with an eye toward a decent, unmarried rancher 4 miles distant was the subject of every gossiping tongue at the mercantile before nightfall regardless of anyone's actual intentions. "That would suit me fine, Mr. Archer," she said. "And I meant what I said about the coffee." They sat that evening on the small step outside her soddy house, drinking coffee from tin cups while the sun went down orange and enormous over the western hills, and they talked, carefully at first and then less carefully, about small things. About Thomas Hayes, who had been a good man and a poor farmer, quick with a joke and slow to anger, who had died coughing blood into a handkerchief while Esther held his hand and prayed the fever would break. About Jacob's own family, a mother who had died of the same influenza that had taken half of Independence, Missouri, the winter he turned 19, and a father he had not spoken to in 11 years and did not particularly wish to. Jacob found himself telling her things he had not told anyone, not the whole truth, not yet, not the years he had spent riding for hire across Texas, and the New Mexico territory doing work that men paid well to have done and paid even better to have forgotten, but enough of the shape of it that she understood. He had not always been a man who mended fences and drank coffee on quiet evenings. "You carry something heavy, Mr. Archer," Esther said at last, when the light had gone violet and the first stars were showing. "I do not ask you to set it down for my sake, but I have carried a heavy thing myself this year, and I find it easier borne when someone else knows the weight of it." Jacob looked at his hands, turning his tin cup between them. "I've done things I'm not proud of," he said. "I came here to stop doing them. 3 days ago I shot a man in the Alhambra Saloon. Self-defense, the whole town will tell you, and it was. But I looked in the mirror after, and I didn't know the man looking back." Esther did not flinch, did not draw away, only watched him with those creekwater eyes gone dark in the fading light. "And who did you see, if not yourself?" "I don't rightly know," Jacob said. "Someone I used to be, someone I promised I wouldn't be again." "Then don't be him," Esther said simply. "You have a whole life left to decide who you are, Mr. Archer. A man is not only the worst thing he has done." It was a small thing, the saying of it, but it landed in Jacob Archer like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples through him that did not stop for days. He rode home that night under a sky thick with stars, and for the first time since the moment in the saloon mirror, the hollow feeling in his chest had something warm sitting alongside it. Over the following weeks, spring turned the prairie green and gold, and Jacob Archer found reasons, more and more of them, to ride the 4 miles to the Hendricks claim. He helped Esther mend the roof of her soddy house, climbing up with a bundle of sod bricks while she called out instructions from below, laughing at his complaints about the itch of dried grass down his collar. He helped her plow the north field for wheat, walking behind the mules with a patience that surprised him, given how little patience farming had ever demanded of him in the years he had spent avoiding it. He brought her a hen and a rooster from his own small flock when a fox took 2 of hers in a single night, and stood in her yard afterward mending the henhouse door while she brought him lemonade and told him, only half joking, that at this rate she would owe him her whole farm in favors before the year was out. "You'll owe me nothing," Jacob said. "A neighbor helps a neighbor, that's all this is." But it was not all it was, and both of them, if pressed honestly, would have admitted as much by the middle of June. There was a way Esther's face changed when she saw his horse coming up the track from town, a lightness that came into her step. There was a way Jacob found himself thinking of her at odd hours, while mending his own fences or sitting alone at his own supper table, wondering what she might be doing at that same moment, whether her wheat had come up even, whether the loneliness of the soddy house pressed on her the way the loneliness of his own house pressed on him. They did not speak of it directly for a long while, both of them wary for their own reasons. Esther because she had loved a good man and buried him, and did not know if her heart had room yet for a second grief should this one, too, be taken from her. Jacob because he did not believe himself worthy of a woman like Esther Hayes, a woman who had looked at the worst thing he had confessed and told him plainly that he could still choose who he became. It was at the town social, held the first Saturday of July in the yard behind the Methodist church, with lanterns strung between the trees and a fiddle player from the Diamond C Ranch hands sawing out reels that had half the town dancing in the dust, that things between them shifted from unspoken to spoken. Jacob had come to the social reluctantly, at Otis Fenn's insistence, the barkeep having taken a strange liking to him since the saloon shooting, and declaring that a man could not spend his whole life avoiding his neighbors over one piece of bad business that had not even been his fault. Esther had come because the church ladies had asked her to bring a pie, and because, if she was honest with herself, she had hoped Jacob Archer might be there. He found her standing near the lemonade table, wearing a blue calico dress that was not new but was carefully kept, her dark hair loose for once from its customary pins and curling softly at her temples in the humid evening air. Jacob stopped a few feet away and simply looked at her for a moment before he could make himself speak, and something in his face must have shown, because Esther's own cheeks colored faintly before he had said a word. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "you look well tonight. Mr. Archer." She smiled, and it was a real smile, not the careful, polite one she wore for the church ladies. "I did not know you danced. I don't recall saying I did." "Well," Esther said, tilting her head toward the fiddle player who had just struck up something lively, "there's no shame in learning." He danced badly, by his own admission afterward, stepping on the hem of her dress twice and losing the rhythm entirely during the turns. But Esther laughed more in those 10 minutes than Jacob had heard her laugh in the 2 months he had known her. And when the song ended and they stood catching their breath at the edge of the lantern light, neither of them moved away from the other. "I have been thinking, Mr. Archer," Esther said more quietly now, "that we have long passed the point where it makes sense for you to keep calling me Mrs. Hayes. What would you have me call you instead?" "Esther will do." "Esther," Jacob said, and the name felt different in his mouth than it had in his thoughts, more solid somehow, more real. "Then you'll call me Jacob." "Jacob," she said, testing it, and something passed between them in the lantern light, unspoken but entirely understood, that had been building since the afternoon her wagon wheel broke in the dusty street of Larkin's Crossing. It was Dutch Meagher who broke the moment, appearing at the edge of the lantern light with 2 other Diamond C hands behind him, his thin face amused in a way that made the amusement look like something closer to cruelty. "Mrs. Hayes," Meagher said, touching his hat with mock courtesy, "Mr. Croft was asking after you just this evening, wondering if you'd given his offer further thought." "You may tell Mr. Croft," Esther said, her voice gone cool and even, "that my answer has not changed and will not change." "That's a shame," Meagher said, "seeing as how things have a way of getting harder for folks who don't take good advice when it's offered. Ain't that right, Archer?" He turned his pale eyes on Jacob with a knowing look that Jacob did not care for at all. "Heard you turned down some easy money a while back yourself. Man, think you'd have learned there's no profit in being stubborn out here. I'd think a man in your position would know better than to threaten a lady in front of half the town," Jacob said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made Meagher's grin falter just slightly. "No threats," Meagher said, holding up his hands. "Just neighborly conversation." He tipped his hat again, mockingly, and moved off into the crowd with his companions, leaving a chill in the warm July night that neither Jacob nor Esther could quite shake for the rest of the evening. "He means to frighten me into selling," Esther said as Jacob walked her to her wagon later, the fiddle music fading behind them. "I will not be frightened." "I know it," Jacob said. "But I'd feel easier if you let me stay closer than 4 miles off, at least until this business with Croft settles one way or another." Esther looked at him in the moonlight, and there was a question in her eyes that went beyond the immediate matter of Silas Croft and his railroad. "And how would you propose to manage that, Jacob Archer, without setting the whole town's tongues wagging?" "I hadn't worked out that particular detail," Jacob admitted, and she laughed, and the tension of Meagher's visit eased, just a little, into something softer between them. He did not kiss her that night, though he wanted to, badly enough that the wanting kept him awake long after he had ridden home under a moon just past full. He told himself it was too soon, that Esther was still finding her way out of grief, and deserved to arrive at whatever came next in her own time, not rushed by his own impatience. But he thought of her constantly in the days that followed, and he began, without entirely admitting it to himself, to think about what it might mean to ask a woman like Esther Hayes to share a life with a man like him. The trouble from Silas Croft, however, did not wait on the slow unfolding of Jacob Archer's courage. It began small, the way such things often did. A section of Esther's wheat field trampled flat one night, as though a herd of cattle had been deliberately driven through it. Her well found fouled with a dead animal a week later, forcing her to haul water from the creek until Jacob helped her clean and redig it. A note left tucked under her door, unsigned, suggesting in polite language that a woman alone might find the coming winter very hard indeed without good neighbors, and that Mr. Croft remained willing to discuss a fair price for her land at any time. Esther brought each incident to Jacob with a steadiness that impressed him even as it worried him, refusing to let fear show in front of Meagher's men should any of them be watching, but confessing to Jacob, in the privacy of her own kitchen, that she woke now at every sound in the night, certain each time that this would be the occasion something worse happened. "You could sell," Jacob said one evening, not because he believed it was the right course but because he needed to know she had considered it and rejected it with clear eyes. "Take Croft's money, go back to your sister in Ohio. No one would think less of you for it." "I would think less of myself," Esther said. "Thomas and I broke this ground together. I buried him in sight of these fields. I will not hand it to a man like Silas Croft because he has more money and meaner men than I do. If I run from every man who thinks a widow is easy prey, I will spend my whole life running, Jacob, and I am done running." Jacob nodded slowly, and something in her fierceness, her refusal to be moved, settled the last of his doubts about what he felt for her. "Then I'm not running either," he said. "Whatever comes of this, you won't face it alone." The town of Larkin's Crossing, for its part, was not blind to what was happening on the homesteads north of it, though few had the courage to speak against Silas Croft directly, given how much of the local economy, from the mercantile's credit accounts to the blacksmith's business shoeing Diamond C horses, depended on Croft's goodwill. The sheriff, an aging man named Walt Prosser who had held the office for 11 years without much trouble beyond the occasional drunk cowhand, proved reluctant to investigate the fouled well or the trampled wheat, citing a lack of witnesses and Croft's own insistence, delivered with an easy smile whenever the subject arose, that he could not be held responsible for the actions of every fool who might bear a grudge against a stubborn widow. It was Otis Fenn, of all people, who first spoke plainly to Jacob about the shape of things. "Crofts had his eye on that whole stretch of land along Rambler Creek for 2 years," Otis said one slow Tuesday afternoon, wiping down his bar while Jacob nursed a coffee rather than anything stronger, having given up drink almost entirely since the shooting. "Ever since word got round the railroad meant to run a spur through here. He's bought out 3 families already, cheap as dirt, on account of he made their lives so miserable they were glad to take his money and go. The Hendricks claim, you're Mrs. Hayes's place. That's the last piece he needs to control the whole right-of-way clean through to the county line. He won't stop just because she's stubborn, Jacob. Man like Croft, stubbornness in someone else just makes him meaner." "Why hasn't anyone stood up to him?" Jacob asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Same reason nobody stood up to you, 3 days before you shot Purdy Slate, when you walked into my saloon looking like a man who'd put a bullet in someone before and might again," Otis said, not unkindly. "Folks are scared, Jacob. Croft's got a dozen hard men on his payroll and a sheriff who owes him money from a bad investment 2 years back that nobody talks about above a whisper. It'd take a braver man than most of us to stand against that." Jacob turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands, thinking of Esther's fierce, tired eyes, the way she had said she was done running, and he felt the old coiled thing inside him stir again, the readiness that he had spent 18 months trying to unlearn. He did not want to be that man again, but he was beginning to understand that there might be no way through this without becoming, at least for a while, someone closer to that man than he wished to be. The matter came to its crisis on a hot, still night in late August, when Jacob, riding out to check on Esther as had become his nightly habit, saw the orange glow of fire against the dark horizon while he was still a mile from her homestead, and put his horse into a hard gallop that ate the remaining distance in minutes that felt like hours. The fire was in her barn, the small structure where she kept her mules and what little hay she had managed to put up for winter, and by the time Jacob arrived, flames were already climbing the near wall, throwing wild orange light across the yard where Esther stood in her nightgown, a bucket in each hand, running back and forth from the well with a desperation that would exhaust itself long before the fire did. Esther. Jacob was off his horse before it had fully stopped, catching her by the shoulders. "Where are the mules?" "I got them out, they're loose in the field, but the hay, Jacob, the hay is all we have for winter. Forget the hay. Get back, get clear of the barn, it could come down." He was already moving toward the well himself, and for the next quarter hour the two of them worked together in the smoke and the heat, hauling water in a hopeless effort to slow the fire enough to save at least the mules' stalls at the far end of the structure, until the roof groaned and began to collapse and Jacob pulled Esther bodily away from the building, both of them coughing, soot-streaked, watching the barn fall in on itself in a shower of sparks against the night sky. When it was over, when there was nothing left to do but watch the embers smolder and make certain the fire did not spread to the dry grass around it, Esther sank down onto an overturned water trough and put her face in her hands, and Jacob saw her shoulders shaking, the fierce composure she had maintained through every previous indignity finally giving way. "I found this," she said, when she had gathered herself enough to speak, and held out a scrap of burnt paper that had been pinned, apparently, to the barn door before the fire was set. Jacob took it and turned it toward what light remained. The words were charred at the edges but legible enough. "Last warning, widow. Sell or lose more than a barn." Jacob felt something in him go very cold and very quiet, a stillness he recognized from years he did not like to remember, and when he spoke his voice had none of the gentleness it usually carried when he spoke to Esther. "This ends now," he said. "I'm riding to Croft's ranch tonight." "No." Esther was on her feet immediately, catching his arm. "Jacob, no. That's exactly what they want, don't you see it? They want you to come at them with a gun, so they have cause to say it was you who started the trouble. Or worse, so they have cause to kill you and call it self-defense the same way you killed Purdy Slate. I have already lost one man I loved to circumstances I could not control. I will not lose another to a fight he walked into out of anger." The words *a man I loved seemed to hang in the smoke-thick air between them, and even in the wreckage of the night, even with the barn still smoldering behind them, something in Jacob's chest turned over at hearing them. "Esther," he said, quieter now, "I can't stand by and watch them burn you out. I won't." "Then don't stand by," Esther said, gripping his arm hard enough to leave marks. "But don't ride into Croft's yard alone in the dark like some avenging angel either, because that is exactly the ending he wants for this story, and I will not have it be yours. We go to the sheriff in the morning together with this note as evidence. We do this the right way in daylight where witnesses can see. Promise me, Jacob." He looked at her for a long moment, the fire dying behind her, her face streaked with soot and tears, and a fierce determination that he found he could not refuse. And he thought of the mirror in the Alhambra saloon, the stranger looking back at him with cold, flat eyes, and he understood with a clarity that steadied something deep inside him, that the difference between that man and the man he wanted to be was precisely this: the willingness to choose the harder, slower path when the quick, violent one lay so temptingly close at hand. "I promise," he said. They rode into Larkin's Crossing together at first light, the burnt note wrapped carefully in a handkerchief in Esther's pocket, and found Sheriff Walt Prosser at his breakfast in the small house behind the jail, looking older and more tired than Jacob remembered him. Prosser read the note twice, turning it over in his thick fingers, and would not meet Esther's eyes when he finally spoke. "I'll look into it," he said. "But Mrs. Hayes, without a witness who actually saw who set the fire, there's little I can charge anyone with. A burnt note isn't proof of who wrote it." "It's proof enough for anyone with sense," Esther said, "and you know as well as I do who's behind it, Sheriff, same as everyone in this town knows it." Prosser's jaw worked silently for a moment. "Knowing and proving are different animals, Mrs. Hayes. I'm sorry. I truly am. I'll ride out and speak to Croft myself, tell him there's been complaints. That's the most I can offer you today." It was not enough, and all three of them in that small kitchen knew it, But Esther thanked him with more grace than Jacob thought the moment deserved, and they left the sheriff's house with nothing more concrete than a promise that carried the weight of a man too frightened, or too compromised, to act on it. "We can't wait on Prosser," Jacob said, once they were outside. "Not with the winter coming and your barn gone and your hay with it. You'll need shelter for those mules before the first frost, and Croft isn't going to stop just because a tired old sheriff paid him a friendly visit." "What do you suggest, then, if not violence and not the law?" Esther asked, some of her earlier fierceness returning now that daylight and the presence of the town around them had restored a measure of her composure. Jacob thought for a long moment, turning over in his mind not the tactics of a gunfighter which came to him easily and which he had promised to set aside, but the tactics of a community which came to him with far more difficulty, given how solitary his life had been for the better part of 15 years. "We tell the town," he said slowly, the idea forming even as he spoke it. "Not just the sheriff, all of them. Every family Crofts pushed or threatened, every hand who's ever heard Meagher give an order he didn't like the sound of. We call a meeting, at the church if the minister will allow it, and we lay the whole business out where everyone can see it plain. Crofts built his power on folks being afraid to speak alone. Maybe he can't stand against everyone speaking together." Esther looked at him with something that was not quite hope, not yet, but was moving in that direction. "Do you think it would work?" "I don't know," Jacob admitted. "But it's a better wager than me riding to his ranch with a pistol, and it's the kind of fight I'd rather win if I'm honest with you. The other kind I've had my fill of." They spent the following week quietly, carefully, visiting the 4 families whose homesteads bordered the proposed railroad right-of-way, and found, to their mingled relief and sorrow, that each family had a similar story to tell. Cut fences, poisoned wells, cattle scattered, threatening notes, all of it carefully calibrated to fall just short of anything the law could easily prosecute, all of it aimed at making the cost of staying higher than the cost of selling cheap and moving on. The Reverend Amos Whitfield, a thin, earnest man newly arrived from Illinois who had not yet learned to be afraid of Silas, Croft the way the town's older residents had, agreed readily to host a meeting in the church, declaring from his own small pulpit the following Sunday that a matter of justice concerning several families of the congregation would be discussed on Wednesday evening, and that all were welcome, and indeed urged to attend. Silas Croft, when word of the meeting reached him, as it inevitably did within hours, sent Dutch Meagher into town with a message for Jacob Archer directly, delivered in the middle of the mercantile with enough onlookers present to ensure it would spread through Larkin's Crossing by supper time. "Mr. Croft wants you to know," Meagher said, leaning against the counter with an insolence that made the storekeeper visibly uncomfortable, "that he's got no quarrel with a man minding his own homestead, so long as that man remembers whose business is whose. Stirring up the whole town over a widow's grazing dispute, though that starts to look like meddling. And Mr. Croft don't take kindly to meddling, Archer. Man in your position, with your history, ought to think real careful about which side of a fight he wants to be standing on when the shooting starts, if it comes to that." Jacob set down the nails he had been examining and looked at Meagher with an expression that made the other men in the store go very still. "Tell Croft," Jacob said, his voice even and quiet in a way that carried further than shouting would have, "that I've thought about it real careful and I've decided. I'm standing with the folks whose land he's trying to steal, and you can tell him something else, Meagher. If one more fire gets set on Esther Hayes's land, or anyone else's along that creek, I'll take it up with the county judge in Topeka myself, in person, with every witness and every burnt note this town can produce, and I expect Croft's railroad friends won't much care for the newspapers getting hold of a story about a cattle baron burning out widows to steal their homesteads. That kind of story tends to travel further than a man like Croft would like." It was not the language of a gun, but it landed with something of the same weight, and Meagher's insolent smile faded a degree before he recovered it and sauntered out of the store without another word, though not before Jacob saw, in the set of his shoulders, that the message had struck somewhere Croft would feel it. The Wednesday meeting drew nearly 40 people to the small Methodist church, far more than Reverend Whitfield's benches could comfortably seat, spilling out into the aisles and the doorway in the warm evening air. Esther spoke first, her voice steady despite the visible effort it cost her, laying out plainly the pattern of harassment her family had endured since Thomas's death, ending with the burnt note that Silas Croft's man had pinned to her barn door before setting it alight. She was followed by the Delacroix family, whose eldest son had been beaten in town 2 months prior by men nobody could identify but everyone suspected, and by old Ezra Todd, whose well had been fouled twice in the past year, and by 3 more families besides, each account building on the last until the shape of Silas Croft's campaign lay exposed before the whole assembled town in a way that no single family's isolated complaint had ever managed to convey. It was Jacob who spoke last, and he found, standing at the front of the small church with the lamplight throwing his shadow long across the whitewashed wall, that the words came to him more easily than he had feared. "I've known violence most of my adult life," he said, and the church went very quiet at that, for enough of them had heard by now the particulars of the Alhambra shooting that his words carried unexpected weight. "I came to this town wanting to leave that behind me, and mostly I have. But I've learned this year that leaving violence behind doesn't mean standing silent while someone else uses it against people who can't defend themselves. Silas Croft has bought this town's silence with fear, one family at a time, same as he's tried to buy Esther Hayes's land. I'm asking you tonight not to fight him with guns, because that's a road that only ends one way, and it's not a road I'll walk again if there's any other choice. I'm asking you to fight him with the truth, told loud enough and by enough people that even a man with Croft's money can't buy it back." The meeting resolved, before it ended, to send a delegation, headed by Reverend Whitfield and including Esther, Ezra Todd, and Jacob himself, to lay the entire matter before the county judge in Topeka, along with sworn statements from every affected family and the physical evidence of the burnt note. It resolved further that the town's own newspaper, a small weekly run by a young editor named Silas Croft, had thus far managed to keep favorably disposed through modest advertising revenue from the Diamond Sea, would be asked, in light of the evening's testimony, to reconsider where its sympathies properly lay. Silas Croft did not take the news of the meeting quietly. 2 nights later, as Jacob rode the familiar track toward Esther's homestead for his nightly visit, he found the road blocked by 4 riders in the darkness, Dutch Meagher among them, and understood immediately that this was not a chance encounter. "Croft sent us to have a word," Meagher said, his voice carrying none of its usual mocking ease now, something harder and more dangerous underneath it. "You've made yourself a problem, Archer, stirring up the whole county against a man who's done nothing but try to build a railroad that'll bring prosperity to this whole territory. Croft's willing to forget the trouble you've caused if you'll ride away tonight and not come back. Leave the widow's business to sort itself out without you meddling further." "That's not an offer I'm inclined to accept," Jacob said, keeping his hands visible and still on his reins, aware of every subtle shift in the 4 horses around him, the old instincts sharpening despite everything he had told himself about leaving them behind. "Wasn't really a question," Meagher said, and Jacob saw the moonlight catch on metal as one of the other riders drew a pistol. What happened next happened very fast, the way such moments always did, faster than thought, governed by reflex trained into muscle and bone over years Jacob had spent trying to forget. He was off his horse and moving before the pistol had fully cleared its holster, and in the confused scramble of shying horses and shouting men that followed, Jacob disarmed the rider who had drawn on him with a blow to the wrist that made the man cry out and drop his weapon into the dirt, then had his own Colt in hand, not fired, only held, aimed steady at Meagher's chest in the moonlight. "Tell Croft," Jacob said, his voice very quiet, very controlled, though his heart was hammering with an adrenaline that felt sickeningly familiar. "That I did not come looking for this fight, and I have not fired a shot tonight, and I do not intend to fire one unless you force my hand. But tell him also that I will not ride away, and I will not stop, and the next time his men block a road in front of me, I may not be so careful about where my bullets land. This is the only warning you'll get from me." The riders withdrew, sullen and shaken, Meagher's face twisted with a fury he did not dare act on with a loaded Colt aimed at his chest, and Jacob rode the rest of the way to Esther's homestead with his hands still trembling slightly from the encounter, not from fear exactly, but from how close he had come to becoming, once again, the man in the saloon mirror. He told Esther everything that night, sitting at her kitchen table with a lamp burning low between them, and when he finished she reached across the table and took his hand in both of hers. "You didn't fire," she said. "That matters, Jacob, that's the whole difference." "It felt the same," Jacob said quietly. "In that moment, before I knew how it would end, it felt exactly the same as every other time I've drawn on a man. I don't know that I can promise you it'll always end without a shot fired. I don't know that I can promise you I'm as changed as I want to be. I'm not asking for a man with no darkness in him," Esther said. "I buried a good man who never raised his voice in anger in his whole life, and I loved him, and I would not trade a single day I had with him. But I am asking now, in this different season of my life, for a man who chooses the light even when the darkness would be easier, even when it's what he knows best. You did that tonight. You'll have chances to do it again before this business with Croft is finished, I expect. I believe you'll keep choosing it, Jacob. I've watched you choose it for 3 months now." Jacob turned his hand in hers, so that their fingers laced together properly, and in the lamplight, with the danger of the evening still humming faintly in his blood, he said the thing he had been circling for weeks without quite finding the courage to land on directly. "I love you, Esther Hayes," he said. "I've loved you, I think, since your wagon wheel broke in the middle of the street and you looked up at me more embarrassed than hurt. I don't know that I've any right to say it, given everything you know about me now, but I find I can't hold it in any longer." Esther's eyes filled, and she did not try to hide it, did not look away. "I love you too, Jacob Archer," she said. "I have for some while. I was only waiting to see if you'd catch up." He kissed her then, finally, there in the low lamplight of her kitchen with the danger of Silas Croft's men still fresh in both their minds, and it was a slow and careful kiss, the kind that came from two people who had each already lost something and understood, better than most, not to rush past the tenderness of finally finding something worth keeping. The delegation to Topeka, undertaken the following week, produced results more swiftly than any of them had dared hope. The county judge, a stern and incorruptible man named Judge Hollis Barnwell, had apparently been receiving quiet complaints about Silas Croft's methods for some time from other quarters of the county, and the sworn statements from 5 separate families, combined with the physical evidence of the burnt note and testimony regarding the armed confrontation on the road, gave him sufficient cause to issue a summons compelling Croft to appear and answer to charges of intimidation and arson. More damaging still, the young newspaper editor in Larkin's Crossing, stirred by the church meeting and further emboldened by the Topeka judge's action, ran a front-page story detailing the entire pattern of harassment, naming Croft and Meagher directly, a story that was picked up within days by papers as far as Kansas City, given how neatly it fit the popular narrative of railroad interests running roughshod over honest homesteaders. Faced with a public exposure he had never anticipated, and a legal proceeding he could not simply buy his way out of, given the judge's evident incorruptibility, Silas Croft's position crumbled with surprising speed. The Kansas Pacific Railroad, unwilling to have its name associated with arson and intimidation in the papers, quietly informed Croft that the spur line would be surveyed along an alternate route 2 miles east, avoiding the disputed homesteads entirely, and rendering the whole conflict moot from a business perspective. Croft, humiliated and facing prosecution, sold off a portion of his herd to cover legal costs, and within 2 months, quietly relocated his operation to a ranch he owned in the Texas Panhandle, leaving Dutch Meagher and his fellow enforcers without employment or purpose, in a county that now regarded them with open suspicion. It was, in the end, not a victory won with guns, and Jacob Archer found himself, in the weeks after Croft's departure, deeply and quietly grateful for that fact. Esther's barn was rebuilt before the first frost, with Jacob and half a dozen neighbors from the delegation lending their labor over 3 long Saturdays, the kind of communal barn raising that Jacob had heard described in stories from gentler places back east, and had never expected to witness with his own eyes on the Kansas prairie. The women of the church brought food enough to feed twice the number of workers, and there was music again, a different fiddle player this time, and dancing in the yard once the frame stood true and solid against the autumn sky. And Jacob, watching Esther laugh in the lantern light surrounded by neighbors who had, in the space of a single summer, become something like family, felt the last of the hollow feeling from the saloon mirror finally, fully empty out of him. He proposed to her in October, on the same step outside her soddy house where they had first shared coffee and confessions, with the wheat harvested and stored, and the mended barn standing solid behind them, and the prairie gone gold and brown with the turning season. He had no ring to offer her, not yet, having spent what savings he had on lumber for the barn raising rather than on jewelry, but he had a small speech prepared that he found, when the moment actually arrived, entirely deserted him, so that what he actually said was simpler and, he thought afterward, better than anything he had rehearsed. "Esther," he said, "I've spent most of my life being a man I wasn't proud of, and this last year, knowing you, has been the first time I've looked forward to the person I might become instead of dreading it. I don't have much to offer you beyond 40 acres and a lot of years still owed to becoming a better man than I've been. But I love you more than I've loved anything in this life, and I'd be grateful beyond telling if you'd marry me." Esther, who had been shelling dried beans into a bowl on her lap and set it aside the moment he began speaking, was crying by the time he finished, though she was laughing too, in the way people sometimes do when joy arrives at last after a long season of grief. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Jacob Archer, I would be glad, more than glad, to marry you." They were married the following spring, in April of 1879, in the same small Methodist church, where the town meeting against Silas Croft had been held, Reverend Whitfield presiding over a ceremony attended by what felt like the whole of Larkin's Crossing, given how the events of the previous summer had woven so many of the town's families together in ways that endured long after Croft himself was gone. Esther wore a dress of pale blue that the church ladies had helped her sew, and Jacob wore a coat that fit him poorly and that he did not care about in the slightest. And when Reverend Whitfield pronounced them husband and wife, the whole church erupted into applause that Jacob would remember for the rest of his life as the exact sound of belonging. They combined their 2 homesteads into a single working ranch, the acreage sufficient, with careful management and hard work, to support a modest herd of cattle alongside the wheat fields Esther had first broken with Thomas Hayes and continued to tend with a fierce, quiet pride that Jacob came to share as fully as his own. Otis Fenn closed the Alhambra Saloon for the afternoon of the wedding, so that he and half the town's regular patrons could attend, and stood at the edge of the reception with a cup of the church ladies' punch instead of his usual whiskey, telling anyone who would listen that he had known, the very afternoon he watched Jacob Archer pull a wounded, embarrassed widow out of the dust of Larkin's Crossing's Main Street, that there was more to that quiet rancher than the trouble that had briefly followed him into the Alhambra's mirror. The years that followed were not without their ordinary hardships, the kind that visited every homestead family on the Kansas prairie in that era. A drought in 1881 that tested their wheat crop nearly to breaking. A hard winter in 1883 that killed off a portion of their cattle before Jacob learned to build better shelter against the worst of the storms. The small griefs and larger joys of a working life built from the ground up. But there was no more violence of the kind that had shadowed Jacob's early years, no more mirrors in which he did not recognize himself. He found in the daily rhythm of the ranch, in the particular satisfaction of watching wheat come up green in a field he had helped plow himself, in the simple domestic pleasure of Esther's cooking and her laughter, and the warmth of her beside him each night, that the man he had feared himself to be in that saloon mirror grew fainter and fainter, not forgotten entirely. For Jacob never allowed himself to forget the weight of what he had done in his younger years, but transformed, gradually and genuinely, into something he could live with, something he could even, on his better days, be proud of. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Esther's first husband, a gesture that moved Jacob more than he had words to express when Esther first suggested it, was born in the winter of 1880, delivered by the same midwife who had helped bury half the babies lost to the harsh winters of that decade, but who declared little Thomas Archer among the healthiest infants she had ever caught. He grew into a solemn, watchful boy who loved horses before he loved anything else, and who would sit for hours on the corral fence watching his father work the young stock, absorbing, without either of them quite realizing it at the time, the particular patience and gentleness that Jacob had cultivated in himself as a deliberate counterweight to the harder years of his youth. Their second child arrived 2 years later, a daughter they named Ruth, after Jacob's own mother, who had died so many years before in the influenza that swept through Independence, Missouri. Ruth grew into a bright, talkative girl who took after her mother's fierce practicality more than her father's watchfulness, and who declared, from the age of 6, that she intended to run the ranch herself one day, a declaration that made Jacob laugh with a pride so full it sometimes ached in his chest. A third child, another son named Walter, after old Ezra Todd's grandson who had become one of Thomas's closest boyhood friends, arrived in 1885, completing a family that filled the once quiet ranch house with a noise and warmth that Jacob, in his loneliest years of riding for hire across the Southwest, could never have imagined for himself. Esther kept, tucked inside the same family Bible that had carried her deed across the prairie from Ohio, the burnt scrap of paper that had been pinned to her barn door on the night Silas Croft's men tried to burn her out, not as a wound to be reopened, but as a reminder of how far they had come, how much they had built together out of a threat that had once seemed capable of destroying everything. She showed it to her children when they were old enough to understand, telling them the story of a widow who refused to be frightened off her land, and a man who chose, in the moment that mattered most, to set aside violence in favor of patience, community, and the slow, difficult work of doing right by his neighbors. Jacob, for his part, never fully lost the watchfulness that had once made him dangerous, that particular stillness and economy of movement that had unsettled Esther slightly on the day they first met. But he learned to turn it toward gentler purposes, toward calming a spooked horse, toward catching a falling child before a tumble became a real injury, toward sitting quietly beside Esther on their porch in the evenings, watching the same enormous prairie sunsets that had first drawn them together, needing no words at all to communicate the depth of what had grown between them. He returned to the Alhambra Saloon only rarely in the years that followed, and when he did, it was for a friendly game of cards with Otis Fenn and the other men of the town who had become, in the crucible of the fight against Silas Croft, something closer to true friends than mere neighbors. On one such visit, some 10 years after the shooting of Purdy Slate, Jacob found himself standing again at that same long mahogany bar, looking again into that same spotted mirror, and this time, when he studied his own reflection, gray now beginning to show at his temples, lines of laughter as well as weather etched around his eyes. He saw a man he recognized fully and without hesitation. A husband, a father, a rancher who had built something lasting out of land and love rather than out of fear and violence. A man who had faced the darkest parts of his own history and chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to become someone better. "You've the look of a satisfied man tonight, Archer," Otis Fenn observed, refilling Jacob's coffee cup, for Jacob still took coffee rather than whiskey on his rare visits to the saloon. "I am that," Jacob said, glancing once more at his own reflection before turning back toward the door, toward the horse waiting outside that would carry him home to Esther and their children before full dark fell across the Kansas prairie. "I've a good wife waiting on me, and 3 children who'll want their supper, and land enough to keep a family fed for generations if we tend it right. A man could do worse than that, Otis. A man could do a great deal worse." He rode home under a sky just beginning to fill with stars, the same stars that had watched over him on the night he first confessed his darkest secrets to a widow on a soddy house step, the same stars that had watched over the barn raising, and the wedding and the births of 3 children who would grow up knowing their father as a man of quiet strength, rather than the cold-eyed stranger who had once looked back at him from a saloon mirror. Esther was waiting on the porch when he arrived, a lamp burning warm in the window behind her, their children's voices carrying faintly from inside the house where they argued cheerfully over some game or another. And as Jacob dismounted and crossed the yard toward her, he felt, as he felt every evening of his life now, the profound and settled gratitude of a man who had once been lost and had, through the fierce love of a woman who refused to be frightened off her own land, finally and completely found his way home. They grew old together on that Kansas ranch, watching their children marry and have children of their own, watching the town of Larkins Crossing grow from a rough cattle trail settlement into a proper town with a schoolhouse and a permanent doctor, and eventually, the railroad spur line that Silas Croft had once tried to steal their land to build, running instead along the alternate route 2 miles east, close enough to bring prosperity to the town, without ever again threatening the homesteads along Rambler Creek. Jacob Archer never fired his pistol at another man after the night he held it steady on Dutch Meager's chest and chose, deliberately, not to pull the trigger. And when he died peacefully in his own bed in the winter of 1911, an old man surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never known him as anything but a figure of quiet strength and abiding love, Esther held his hand until the very last breath left him. And she told their assembled family afterward that Jacob Archer had spent the last 33 years of his life proving, every single day, that a man could look into the darkest reflection of himself and still choose, again and again, to become someone worth loving. She lived 4 years longer than he did, tended in her final seasons by her daughter Ruth, who had indeed grown up to help run the ranch just as she had promised as a child. And when Esther Hayes Archer passed in the spring of 1915, she was buried beside her husband in the small cemetery behind the same Methodist church where they had married 36 years before, not far from the grave of Thomas Hayes, the good man she had loved and lost before finding. Against every reasonable expectation of a hard and unforgiving frontier, a second great love that had carried her through the rest of her days. Their children and grandchildren kept the ranch running for generations afterward, and the story of the widow who would not be frightened off her land, and the gunfighter who set down his violence to help her keep it, passed into the kind of local legend that Kansas families told around their own hearths for decades to come, a story not of blood and vengeance, though both had brushed close enough to touch them, but of patience, community, and the particular redemptive power of a love strong enough to show a lost man, staring into a saloon mirror at a stranger he did not recognize, exactly who he still had the chance to become.